Hello and welcome everyone, and today I want to show you how to craft 7-link attack-based weapons for physical melee or minion builds that you want to use in tandem with the Squire. The crafting is based on utilizing a range of different meta crafting techniques that I will be talking about in detail. In general, there are a couple of steps involved in crafting this weapon, and I made this flowchart to visualize the entire process, and I'm going to leave a link to it in the comments below. Don't fret, it looks more complicated than it actually is. The reason why it's so convoluted is because I wanted to map out the entire hyperspace of the crafting process with the exception of certain loops, which I'm going to show you in a sec. Before we take a deep dive into the flowchart, I want to explain the basics of this craft. The prefixes are crafted by combining a Shaper base with socketed skills deal more attack damage, and an Elder base with socketed skills are supported by Ruthless, using an Awakener's Orb. We then introduce the Multistrike by crafting prefixes cannot be changed and using the Harvestcraft Reforged Speed. Followed by crafting a block mod, and Exalt slamming for socketed gems are supported by Maim, critical damage or critical strikes, and finishing the craft by replacing the third prefix with +2 level of socketed support gems. Sounds easy enough, so why the convoluted flowchart? Well, it's actually a bit more complicated than I made it out earlier, because all the steps I mentioned aren't deterministic, with the exception of the last one, and the flowchart simply maps all the possibilities that are relevant for the crafting process, with the exception of certain loops. Before we get started, I like to point towards the legend, which includes a couple of abbreviations I included in order to not blow the flowchart out of proportion. Most of this is pretty self-explanatory, with maybe one exception, Brick, which is not an abbreviation, but a state of being, state of being for your item. It is what your item turns into when you accidentally remove the Ruthless or socketed skills deal more attack damage modifier, at which point I'm afraid you have to restart the entire crafting process. As I mentioned earlier, you're going to start out with an Elder base with the Ruthless modifier and a Shaper base with the socketed skills deal more attack damage modifier, and you're going to combine both mods on the more appropriate base using an Awakener's Orb, which opens up a range of possibilities. For example, you can end up with an item that has 3 suffixes, which means you then have to use an Orb of Annul, and dependent on what you hit and how the prefixes are, you're going to move towards one of the other states that you can see here. For example, if you remove Ruthless or socketed skills deal more attack damage, you've bricked your item and you have to restart. If you remove one of the suffixes and the item has a third prefix that does not have an attack tag, you end up here, which is actually the preferred state because this is the state that allows us to move forward. If instead the third prefix has an attack tag, you would end up here. And in order to move forward, you have to remove that third prefix using an Orb of Annulment, which can do one of two things. You can either remove one of the 2 prefixes you want to retain and brick your item, or it can remove that prefix, and you would end up here with an item that has 0 to 2 suffixes without a third prefix. You can also arrive at this state from the initial step, meaning the usage of an Awakener's Orb. Independently of how you arrive at this state, you can put on cannot roll attack modifiers and use an Exalted Orb to introduce a new prefix, and this prefix cannot have an attack tag, which will then land us in our preferred state, the one that allows us to move forward. And we can now do what I mentioned earlier in the video, which is put on prefixes cannot be changed and reforge speed. I also mentioned certain loops in the crafting process that I didn't visualize, and this is probably the best example because on average, if you put on prefixes cannot be changed and use the Harvestcraft Reforged Speed, you're going to end up with an item with 0 to 2 suffixes and a third non-attack prefix that doesn't have Multistrike as one of the suffixes, meaning that doing this very often just maps back onto itself. And I didn't include this loop and the ones you encounter later, where you have to put on a meta mod and then use an orb of annulment, which can obviously create a loop by removing that meta mod again, because it doesn't add any new states. Instead, it just maps back onto the state where you came from, and I didn't want to make this flowchart any more convoluted than it already is. Other relevant outcomes for this step in the crafting process includes you introducing 3 suffixes, at which point you have to null again, or you introducing the multistrike with either 1 additional suffix or 2 additional suffixes, at which point you would have to use an orb of annulment, and using that orb of annulment will get you to either this or this state, depending on the second suffix, either having an attack tag or not having one. In general, you might have noticed that there are a couple of red lines, connections that I have not mentioned. And I've done this deliberately because these lines only become relevant later in the crafting process when you've already introduced multistrike via the prefixes cannot be changed reforge speed crafting. So early on in the crafting process, you can completely ignore them. As I said, they only become relevant once you've introduced the multistrike. Now, if you have the multistrike and have 1 additional suffix, and this suffix has an attack tag, you need to put on prefixes cannot be changed and use an orb of annulment in order to remove it. If you accidentally remove the multistrike, you end up in the previous state. So you would have to then put on prefix cannot be changed and reforge speed until you hit the multistrike again. Or you get lucky and hit the other modifier, which will give you an item with multistrike, without additional suffixes, and all the prefixes that we want to have. Alternatively, you could end up with an item that has the multistrike and an additional suffix, but that suffix does not have an attack tag. And at that point, you put on cannot roll attack modifiers, and you have to use an orb of annulment, which can either accidentally remove the dummy prefix, which you can then slam back on immediately using an exalted orb, or remove the non-attack suffix. And you would end up here too, right? An item that has the 3 prefixes that we want and also has multistrike. The next step, so the exalted slam, will cost you the most currency because you're going to have to repeat this part of the crafting process a lot, probably some 50 to 100 times or so, until you actually end up hitting one of the 3 target modifiers. So socketed skills are supported by MAME, critical damage or critical strikes. Especially introducing an attack mod always carries the risk of you removing multistrike, which will then bring you back to this state, at which point you have to reforge speed, which can accidentally introduce 3 suffixes, meaning even though you're already at this point, you can always go back to this portion, which carries the inherent risk of bricking your item. For me, that's exactly what ended up happening. I bricked one of my items this exact way. You can circumvent this. In general, you can save a lot of currency by simply stopping after this step, by putting on cannot roll attack modifiers and annulling until you remove the dummy prefix already before actually going for the second suffix, which will probably save you 80% of the cost while losing you maybe 20% of the damage. Whether you want to do this is of course up to you. Eventually you should end up hitting one of the 3 modifiers though. I would say average crafting cost should be between 50 and 100 divines for this item. So getting to this point, that is. And once you've done that, you put on cannot roll attack modifiers and use an orb of annulment, which can either remove the meta mod, which loops back to this state, or you remove the dummy prefix. This is why I was so insistent earlier that you need to make sure that you have an item that does not have a third prefix with an attack tag, because you would have to use an orb of annul without a meta mod, gambling the entire item, just because you skipped this initial step, right, where you end up with an item that has these exact specifications. But if you didn't do that, then the last step, as I mentioned before, is deterministic, meaning you might accidentally remove the meta mod once or twice, but you can deterministically remove the dummy prefix and thus end up with an item that has 4 modifiers and an open prefix, which you can then fill with a crafted modifier. For me, that's +2 level of socketed support gems, but could of course be something different as well. And at that point, you have to decide how you want to finish your item. You can either just go for a YOLO Exalt slam, right, hoping to introduce a third suffix that has some sort of use, hoping for one of the 2 remaining modifiers, the ones that you didn't roll earlier. The chance of success is obviously very low. Personally, I still think this is the best way to go, because the alternative is very expensive. The alternative being you using tempering orbs to roll for a specific enchant. Can have 1 additional crafted modifier, at which point you can put on not just a prefix, but also a crafted suffix of your choosing. But since this step costs you anywhere between 20 and 100 divines, I don't think it's sensible, honestly. But that's of course up to you. For the Crucible mods, you can either craft them after crafting the explicits, or craft them on the base that you end up with after using the Awakener's Orb, which also allows you to utilize imprints, which isn't necessarily cheaper, but does speed up the process a lot. Optimally, you want to roll critical damage or critical strikes as a second suffix, and put on plus level of socketed int gems, impale, and maim as Crucible mods. If you however roll maim on the explicits, you're going to have to replace the maim with fortify on the Crucible mods, because they obviously don't stack. And now I'm going to show you the streamlined in-game crafting process of my weapon. I started out with a Shaper-influenced dagger with the socketed skills deal more attack damage, and an Elder's Sai, which is the best base because it's the only one-handed weapon that has a useful implicit for minion builds. The Sai obviously had the Ruthless mod, and I used an Awakener's Orb to craft the Shaper mod onto the Elder base. As you can see, the weapon does have a third prefix that doesn't have an attack tag, and has only 1 suffix, so we can go ahead and start rolling for Multistrike. I eventually hit the Multistrike, but also introduced a second suffix without an attack tag, so I crafted on cannot roll attack modifiers and used an Orb of Annulment. After removing the second suffix, I can put on the block mod by crafting strength, dex, and accuracy, slammed an exalted orb, and ended with a second suffix with an attack tag, so I put prefixes cannot be changed on the item and used an Orb of Annulment to remove it. I repeated this process without hitting anything and had to farm more currency to continue the crafting process. I used all the aforementioned crafting techniques in order to hit one of the target mods, which, as you're going to find out, took me quite some time, so buckle up and enjoy the show while I'm going to get myself a coffee. As you can see, I finally ended up hitting one of the 3 target mods. Sadly, I ended up with Maim, which is by far the worst of the 3, but at that point there's nothing you can do about it. After that, I crafted cannot roll attack modifiers and used an Orb of Annulment to remove the dummy prefix, which took me a couple tries, followed by crafting +2 levels of socketed support gems. And at that point, I decided to finish the item by going for the Exalt slam. But of course I did not end up hitting anything interesting. That's pretty much it for the craft. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments below. I'll try to get to them as soon as I can. And hope you're more lucky than I was. See you in the next one.